Hello, and welcome to the lectures on abortion. So, in these lectures, I will cover the standard abortion debate. And when I say the standard debate, I mean among professional ethicists, rather than sort of the talking points you'd hear on the news or when encountering someone on the street about the abortion issue. And then we'll cover two pro-choice arguments: Marianne Warren's argument, Judith Jarvis Thompson's argument, and then two pro-life arguments: Patrick Lee's argument and Don Marquis' argument. So let's talk about the standard debate. And this is mainly taken from Don Marquis, an argument that abortion is wrong, but also from Marianne Warren's on the moral and legal status of abortion. So here's a common pro-life strategy in philosophical literature. Number one, you argue or claim that human life is present from conception. Two, you rely on the principle that it is always prima facie seriously wrong to take a human life. And then three, you conclude from 1 and 2 that abortion is morally akin to murder. So here's an example. Number one, fetuses are both human and alive from conception. Number two, humans have the right to life. Three, therefore, so this is a conclusion, fetuses have the right to life. Four, and it's carrying on the argument past beyond the conclusion, so it's a two-stage argument. Women have the right to control their own bodies, but the right to life overrides the right of a woman to control her own body. Five, therefore abortion is morally wrong. Okay, so the idea with number one is that fetuses are, it doesn't even say human beings, just says they're human, which is true. Fetuses have a human genetic code, and they're alive. And that's true too if we're talking about biologically alive. So number one is definitely true, and even from conception. Two, humans have a right to life. That seems like a no-brainer. Three, therefore fetuses have a right to life. That just follows from the first two premises. Four, women have the right to control their own bodies, but the right to life overrides the right of a woman to control her own body. So here you would ask, what's more important, autonomy or life? So if there's a clash between someone's autonomy and someone else's life, which would sort of rule the day? Which one would trump the other? So perhaps, well, the pro-lifer would say, yeah, definitely your right to autonomy doesn't give you the right to kill anyone else. And therefore, it does follow from all this that abortion is morally wrong. So what do you think of this argument? Post in the comments if you like. Then there's a common pro-choice strategy. Number one, argue or claim that fetuses are not persons. Two, rely on the principle that being a person is what gives an individual intrinsic moral worth. And three, conclude from 1 and 2 that abortion is not a wrongful killing. So for example, well, not for example, I have to define being a person. So the pro-lifer defends the claim that the fetus is a human, let's just say a human being. And the pro-choicer makes a distinction between being a human being and being a person. Being a person, on their view, is a moral or a philosophical concept rather than a biological one. So on their view, being a person is like, you can't be a person unless you possess certain psychological capacities. And this is Marianne Warren's moral sense of being human, which we'll encounter in following lecture in the series. And being a person is supposed to be necessary for possessing intrinsic moral worth. So you're not a person unless you can engage in rationality, you're self-aware, engage in complex communication. Says this is what the pro-choicer says. And since the fetus can't do any of those things, it's not a person. So before the fetus has these psychological capacities, say at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, it is merely human and not a person, and so therefore it lacks intrinsic moral worth. So here's a common pro-choice argument. Number one, only persons have intrinsic moral worth, that is, are valuable as an entity in themselves, valuable in themselves rather than sort of their instrumental value. Two, fetuses are not persons. Three, therefore fetuses do not have intrinsic moral worth, and so abortion is permissible. So number one, only persons have intrinsic moral worth. That one, only persons have intrinsic moral worth. It's hard to really defend, actually. So because I mean, like puppies, right? Can you just go kick a puppy? No, they seem to have intrinsic moral worth. And so, maybe the pro-choicer could say something like, only persons have the intrinsic moral worth relegated to persons, something like that. But that would be circular, or a tautology. But the idea is that maybe not that persons are the only things that have intrinsic moral worth, but they're the things that have the most intrinsic moral worth. And so a puppy would have some moral worth, but not to the extent that a person would. Two fetuses are not persons, and so they lack the moral worth of persons. Therefore, fetuses do not have intrinsic moral worth, so abortion is permissible. If you wanted to, say they had some moral worth, you'd have to say something like fetuses do not have the intrinsic moral worth of persons, and so therefore it is not murder, or something like that. Okay, so Don Marquis, in his article, An Argument That Abortion is Morally Wrong, he thinks that the first premise in the strategies for both sides, pro-life, pro-choice, seems right. So the pro-life principle that human life is present from conception, that's true. There's no getting around that. And the pro-choice principle that fetuses are not persons, well, if persons are these things with these certain psychological capacities like self-awareness, then yeah, the fetus is not a person. And then Marquis thinks that the moral principles relied on by both sides seem right. On the pro-life side, it is always prima facie seriously wrong to take a human life. And on the pro-choice side, being a person is what gives an individual intrinsic moral worth. But upon further inspection, there are problems with the principles. The pro-life principle, it's always prima facie seriously wrong to take a human life. This is too broad. Well, what about capital punishment, right? So maybe you would say something like, okay, if we add the word innocent in there, it is always prima facie seriously wrong to take an innocent human life. Okay, well then, with capital punishment, you're taking the life of a guilty person, not an innocent person. What about self-defense? Can you ever kill an innocent person in self-defense? Okay, so maybe you can, right? So a person is falling down on you from a fourth-story window. You have a phaser that would just vaporize him, and he's heavy. He's gonna fall on you and kill you. You don't have time to get out of the way, but you have time to just your vaporizer's already pointed at him somehow, and so you shoot the vaporizer. He vaporizes. Well, he was innocent in the sense that maybe he fell out of the window. He wasn't meaning to harm you, and yet you vaporized him. Did you do something morally wrong? So maybe it is sometimes okay to take in the life of an innocent human being. I don't know. It's also too broad because it says human life, and so that doesn't necessarily mean human being. So you take a skin cell, it's human, it has a human genetic code, and it's living, so it's a human life. But if I just scratch my arm, I'm not committing genocide. Oh dang, I just killed 30 skin cells, but I'm not a moral monster. But I took a human life, the life of a skin cell. So maybe the pro-life principle could be a human being. So here's a better principle then. It is always prima facie seriously wrong to take the life of an innocent human being. But then maybe it has an exception with the case of self-defense. I don't know. And we could also add the word intentionally. It is always prima facie seriously wrong to intentionally take the life of an innocent human being. Because maybe sometimes you take the life of an innocent human being, but you didn't mean to. You ran into them with your car or something, right? Okay, so we could tweak the pro-life principle. The pro-choice principle, being a person is what gives an individual intrinsic moral worth. This is too narrow. Why? We already talked about puppies. Puppies have intrinsic moral worth. You can't just use them as a soccer ball or something. So the pro-choicer is going to have to modify this principle. Maybe, I'm not even sure what that would be. but maybe it's having the having the rights of having the right to life, so that maybe it's okay to take the life of a cow, supposing it is. Maybe you don't think so, but take the life of a cow, eat them. But like persons, you can't just take their lives and for whatever reason you eat them. So they're going to have to tweak this principle because we want to protect the lives of certain non-person animals, right? Okay. So pro-lifers sometimes give an argument based on personhood rather than being a human life, one that relies on the same principle about killing persons that the pro-choicers rely on. So here's the argument. So every person has a right to life since persons have intrinsic moral worth. 2, the fetus is a person. 3, therefore the fetus has a right to life. 4, women have the right to control their own bodies, but the right to life overrides the right of a woman to control her own body. 5, therefore abortion is morally wrong. So the pro-lifer would define personhood in a sense that's different from the way the pro-choicer defines personhood. The pro-choicer defines personhood in terms of these higher order psychological capacities, whereas the pro-lifer thinks that personhood exists from conception, even before those psychological capacities. So they would basically sort of say that every human being is a person, and so maybe the category of person would be broader than the category of human being, and that the category human being would fit within the category of person, so that any human being counts as a person, and maybe since the category of persons is broader than the category of human beings, maybe like there are some non-human persons, angels, aliens, I don't know. Okay, so this is the way that pro-lifers sometimes go. But the problem is that pro-choicers, they don't accept that a fetus is a person, since persons, according to them, must have the psychological capacities mentioned earlier, but fetuses lack these capacities. So there's a standstill here. The common pro-life argument, the common pro-choice argument leads to just a butting of heads because they each have their own principles that are not in common. So Don Marquis gives a way forward, and we'll get to his lecture later. But there you have it. That's the standard abortion debate.